To call Israel a European colonial project is not an act of historical analysis, but of ideological inversion. It takes the vocabulary of imperial guilt and applies it to the one people who returned to their ancestral land not to exploit it, but to survive. The colonialism narrative did not arise from the archives of history, but from the rhetoric of political struggle. Its earliest appearance was at the First Palestinian Congress in Jerusalem in 1919, when Arab elites, many themselves beneficiaries of Ottoman and British patronage, sought to frame Jewish immigration as a foreign intrusion. This framing was not descriptive, but strategic. It allowed the Arab leadership to cast Zionism as an extension of European imperialism, even though the Jews who arrived were stateless refugees fleeing that very Europe. The narrative gained new life decades later, not in the Middle East but in European universities. In the late 1980s, the so-called new historians reframed the Israeli story through the lens of post-colonial theory, emphasizing Palestinian suffering and minimizing Jewish historical continuity. Their work coincided with a wave of European self-reproach over colonialism, and with Arab funding that carried these ideas into American and Israeli academia. What began as a political slogan became an academic orthodoxy, a moral shorthand that replaced historical complexity with ideological symmetry. If Europe had colonies, Israel must be one of them. But the analogy collapses under scrutiny. Colonialism presupposes a metropole, a mother country that sends settlers to extract resources and rule over natives. Zionism had no metropole. It was not an arm of Britain or France, but a movement of a dispersed people seeking national restoration. The Jews who came to Palestine did not arrive as conquerors but as immigrants, often penniless, often traumatized, building farms and schools on land purchased legally. They did not subjugate a native population in the name of a distant crown. They sought coexistence and were met with rejection and violence. To equate this with European conquest is to erase the difference between power and survival. The colonial paradigm also fails to account for the moral and historical uniqueness of Zionism. European colonialism was driven by the pursuit of wealth and dominion. Zionism was driven by the pursuit of refuge and renewal. The settlers of Africa and Asia came to rule foreign peoples. The Jews came to rejoin their own history. The biblical and historical connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel is not a myth invented in 1948, but a continuous thread of memory, prayer, and presence. To call this colonial is to deny the very possibility of historical return, to treat every act of restoration as an act of usurpation. The timing of Israel's birth, 1948, has often been used to reinforce the colonial analogy. As European empires were collapsing, a new Jewish state appeared, and to many in the Third World it seemed anachronistic, a late echo of settler colonialism. But this perception confuses coincidence with causality. The Jews did not arrive to replace the British Empire. They arrived as its subjects and victims. The British, far from sponsoring Zionism, restricted Jewish immigration even as Europe burned. The foundation of Israel was not the extension of empire, but its undoing. A people without power, reclaiming sovereignty in the vacuum left by imperial retreat. The colonial narrative also depends on a moral reversal that turns victims into aggressors. Jewish refugees fleeing European persecution were recast as colonial military occupiers, as if Auschwitz had produced conquistadors. This inversion ignores centuries of Jewish-Muslim coexistence and the fact that the Arab rejection of partition in 1947 was not resistance to colonialism, but refusal of compromise. The wars that followed were not anti-imperial uprisings, but campaigns to prevent Jewish self-determination. To describe them otherwise is to rewrite the moral grammar of decolonization itself. When confronted with historical reality, the colonialist paradigm disintegrates. Jewish immigrants did not arrive armed to seize the land, they arrived to cultivate it. They did not impose foreign rule, They built institutions of self-government under the shadow of British control. They did not exploit native labor. They created a mixed economy that offered employment and education to Arab neighbors. The Zionist project was not extraction, but construction, not domination, but restoration. Its failures and injustices are real, but they are not colonial in nature. They belong to the tragic complexity of national revival, not to the logic of imperial conquest. The persistence of the colonial narrative reveals more about its proponents than about its subject. It is a projection of European guilt onto Jewish history, a way for post-colonial theorists to universalize their moral categories by forcing Israel into them. It allows Europe to expiate its sins by condemning the Jews who survived them. It allows Arab regimes to disguise their own failures under the banner of anti-imperialism. And it allows Western academics to perform moral virtue without confronting the uncomfortable fact that Zionism is not a story of domination, but of return. To refute the colonial analogy is not to deny Palestinian suffering or the injustices of conflict. It is to insist that historical categories must fit the facts. Zionism was not a European colonial enterprise, but a Jewish act of self-determination. It arose not from imperial ambition, but from existential necessity. It was the answer of a people expelled from every empire, persecuted by every nation, and finally resolved to build a home where they could be both free and responsible. To call that colonialism is to turn history into propaganda and tragedy into accusation. The truth is simpler and harder. Israel was not Europe's last colony, but Europe's orphan.